In the spring of 2003, every grain farmer within 40 kilometers of Eckville, Alberta, laughed at Sylvie Marchand. They laughed at the co-op elevator on Highway 11. They laughed at the Tim Hortons on the main road, where the older farmers gathered every Thursday morning before the roads got soft. They laughed at the Ag Society meeting in the Legion Hall in March, when the topic was supposed to be canola input prices, and someone brought up Sylvie instead. The Marchand woman had driven 7 hours south to Lethbridge in February, in a whiteout that had closed the Ponoka interchange for 6 hours, and she had come home with 60 pounds of Saskatoon root stock, 40 crowns of SEA buckthorn, and a contact number for a Ukrainian agronomist at the University of Lethbridge, who was studying nitrogen-fixing shrubs on the northern prairie. She was going to plant them on the west edge of her wheat ground. In the field she'd been fighting to keep productive since her husband Gord had died in November of 2001 and left her with 480 acres of Peace River soil, a John Deere 7800 with a cracked block, and an operating loan at 31% of the farm's assessed value. The laughter was not vicious. These were Alberta farmers. They didn't do vicious. What they did was quiet and persistent, the kind of laughter that sounds like concern, that comes dressed in phrases like "just thinking of you" and "you've got enough on your plate already." Sylvie Marchand was 43 years old. She had married Gord when she was 26, had farmed beside him for 17 years, had run the combine every harvest, had kept the books, had negotiated with the elevator 3 consecutive years when the basis went sideways, and Gord's back had gone out the same week. She knew this farm better than anyone alive. And still the laughter found her, the way it always finds women who make decisions alone. Her father-in-law, Herb Marchand, who was 74 and lived in the original farmhouse 200 meters east of the house Sylvie shared with her 2 children, heard about it the same week. He didn't come over immediately. Herb was a man who let things settle before he spoke. He had farmed the same section of central Alberta for 50 years, and had learned that the distance between a fast opinion and a useful one was usually about 3 days. He came on a Wednesday evening. He knocked, which he never did. Sylvie was at the kitchen table with the farm's financial statements spread in front of her, and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside the papers. Herb. He sat down. He looked at the papers. He did not mention the papers. "There's talk, I know there is. They're saying you bought shrubs. I bought 2 native shrub species and 60 pounds of rootstock for a pilot planting on the West Quarter." He was quiet for a moment. The West Quarter was the problem quarter. It had always been the problem quarter. It faced southwest, which, in that part of Alberta, meant it caught every Chinook and every spring dry spell, and the topsoil on the south slope had thinned by half in the 30 years since Herb had first broken it. Gord had talked about retiring that ground entirely, which was another way of saying he'd been losing money on it for a decade and didn't know what else to do. Sylvie, the West Quarter, hasn't gone a full season without a write-down in 11 years. I know. That's why I'm not planting wheat on it anymore. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent 50 years in soil, and they showed it, and he didn't mind that they showed it. What does the Ukrainian woman say? Her name is Dr. Oksana Petrenko. She says that SEA buckthorn, on a southwest-facing slope in Zone 3, can break wind load by 60% in year 4. She says that Saskatoons interplanted at the south edge can start generating revenue in year 3. She says that both species fix nitrogen in the root zone, which means by year 5, the wheat ground to the east of the planting will be showing higher protein content with less synthetic input. She drove all that way to hear this. I drove all that way to hear this. I paid my own gas. It cost me $93 in fuel and one night in a Lethbridge motel, and I ate a sandwich in the truck because I couldn't afford the restaurant. Herb was quiet. He drank the cold tea without mentioning it was cold. You're going to be laughed at for a while yet. I know. The laughter went sideways and downward, like water finding the low spots. It reached the elevator agent, a man named Darrell, who had been sourcing Sylvie's grain contracts since 1995, in 1990, and who called her in early April, ostensibly to discuss the spring wheat price, but actually to say, gently, that he'd heard about the shrubs and that the elevator's lending partner had flagged her file for a risk review. It reached the local farm credit office in Red Deer, where a loan officer named Greg had been managing Sylvie's farm account for 2 years and who drove out in late April and sat at the same kitchen table where Herb had sat in March and said that he wasn't there to cause trouble, he just wanted to understand the plan. Sylvie showed him Dr. Petrenko's agronomic report. She showed him the soil test from the West Quarter, which confirmed what she already knew. The topsoil on the south slope was at 51% of its 1970 organic matter baseline and was declining at 2% per year. She showed him her own projections, done in the same accounting ledger she'd kept since her first year farming with Gord, showing the net return per acre on the West Quarter for each of the past 11 years. The best year had been 2000. The worst had been 1998. The average was $14 per acre above operating cost, against a capital depreciation requirement of $22 per acre. She was losing $8 an acre on a field she couldn't afford to lose. She put the ledger on the table between them. Greg, the West Quarter is not a wheat field anymore. It stopped being a wheat field in about 1992. I just didn't have the paperwork to prove it until now. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He was a farm loan officer in central Alberta. He had seen a lot of numbers. These numbers were not the numbers of a woman who had lost her head. He approved the file. He didn't tell Sylvie he'd approved it because of the meeting. He sent the letter 2 weeks later in the usual way, as if nothing unusual had happened. But he stopped by the Tim Hortons the following Thursday and told the older farmers quietly that the Marchand woman knew exactly what she was doing, and maybe they should let her do it. The laughter quieted after that. Not entirely, but it moved from the front room to the back. Sylvie planted the first row of SEA Buckthorn on May 9, 2003. She had help from her daughter Lucy, who was 12, and from her son Theo, who was 15 and who had the same quality his father had of appearing at the machinery at the exact moment the machinery needed someone to appear. Theo did not ask questions. He dug where his mother told him to dig. He carried where she told him to carry. He had been doing this since November of 2001, from the week of his father's funeral, and he had not stopped since. Lucy asked questions. Lucy had always been the asking one, the way some children take the weight of the family's curiosity on themselves and carry it for everyone. She had a composition notebook with a green cover that she carried in her jacket pocket, and she wrote things in it during the planting and on the drive to school, and at lunch, and the notebook had been mostly full since Christmas. She had written Dr. Petrenko's name on the first page. She had written the Latin names of both shrub species in the second line, carefully, with a question mark after each one, because she wasn't sure of the spelling and wanted to look it up later. Mom. Yes. What will they look like by fall? They'll be 18 inches, maybe 2 feet. Not much to see. What about next year? 3 to 4 feet. Still not much. What about after that? Lucy. The first 3 years are root years. The shrub is building underground. The part you can see above ground is almost not the point for the first 3 years. Lucy wrote this down. Like how an iceberg is mostly under the water. Yes, exactly like that. She wrote iceberg in the notebook with an arrow to SEA BUCKTHORN. The summer of 2003 was dry. The West Quarter, which had never handled drought well, showed stress in July in the usual places. The South Slope, the exposed ridge along the fence line, the low spot in the northwest corner that had been losing topsoil to the access road for 15 years. The 48 crowns of SEA BUCKTHORN that Sylvie had planted along the west fence line went dormant in August and looked, to anyone driving past on the grid road, like nothing at all. A neighbor named Spencer Dahl, who farmed the quarter section to the west and who had watched the planting with the expression of a man watching someone do something he could not stop, but also could not endorse, stopped his truck on the road one afternoon in August and looked at the row of dormant shrubs for a long moment. He did not stop at the house. He drove on. Spencer Dahl was not a bad man. He was a 61-year-old wheat farmer who had run his operation the same way his father had run it, and his grandfather before that, and he had done well enough by that method that the method had become for him the definition of what farming was. What Sylvie was doing on the West Quarter was not, by his definition, farming. It was something else. He didn't have a word for it. He used the word available to him, which was risky, and he used it at the co-op and at the elevator and at the Legion Hall, and the word traveled the way words do in small farming communities. And it reached Sylvie by October, when Lucy came home from school and said that Cody Dahl had told her that his dad said the Marchand operation was in trouble. Sylvie finished making supper before she responded to this. Lucy, yeah, write this down. The West Quarter had an operating loss per acre last year, and the year before, and the year before that. The SEA BUCKTHORN is in the ground, and it isn't going anywhere. We planted it correctly, and it will come up in the spring. She stirred the pot. What Spencer Dahl thinks about what we're doing is his business. What we know about what we're doing is ours. There is a difference between those two things, and it is important to keep track of which pile of information belongs where. Lucy wrote it down. She wrote it verbatim in the green notebook and underlined the last sentence. Dr. Oksana Petrenko drove up from Lethbridge in April of 2004 to see the first year planting. She was 56 years old. She had come to Canada from the Kherson region of Ukraine in 1989, the same year the Soviet system was beginning to disassemble itself, and had done her doctoral work in soil science at the University of Saskatchewan before taking a faculty position in Lethbridge in the mid-90s. Her specialty was nitrogen dynamics in perennial plantings on degraded prairie soil, and she had been studying what SEA BUCKTHORN did to the root zone of surrounding annuals for 11 years. With a dataset that was, as of 2004, the most detailed in Canada. She drove a 2001 Civic that had 280,000 kilometers on it. She arrived at the Marchand farm at 8 in the morning. She walked the planting. She took soil cores. She measured every plant. She sat at the kitchen table with Sylvie and Lucy and Herb, who had walked over from the original house when he saw the Civic in the driveway, and she drank black coffee and said that the planting was, technically, exactly as specified. Sylvie: yes, Dr. Petrenko. You planted on a 30-inch spacing. Correct. The crown-to-crown distance on the Saskatoons is better than I usually see from first-year planters. You measured twice. I measured 3 times. Lucy was watching from the table. Theo was supposed to be at school. He was in the doorway instead. Dr. Petrenko stayed for 2 days. She walked all 4 quarters with Sylvie, taking notes. She had not seen the east quarter before. The east quarter was good ground. It had been broken in 1952 by Herb's father with a D4 cat, and the topsoil was still 4 inches deep across most of it, which was unusual for that area of Alberta, which had been losing topsoil steadily since the 60s. The east quarter was carrying the farm. She said so, directly. The east quarter is carrying the farm. Yes. For how much longer? Sylvie was quiet for a moment. Dr. Petrenko, I have run this farm since November of 2001, and the east quarter has been carrying everything since about 1998. That can't keep going. What do you need? I need the west quarter to stop being a liability. I need the soil biology on the south slope to start recovering. I need a secondary revenue stream that isn't tied to wheat price, because wheat price is going to keep doing what it has been doing since 1999. Dr. Petrenko nodded. She had heard versions of this sentence from a dozen prairie farmers in the previous 5 years. Sylvie was the first one who had already started doing something about it before asking for permission. The SEA buckthorn, she said, will bear in year 4. The first commercial harvest will be small, but the berry is worth $4 a pound to the health food wholesalers in Calgary and Edmonton, and there are 3 buyers I can introduce you to who are currently sourcing entirely from Russia and Romania because there is no Canadian supply. None. The market exists. The supply does not. You can be the supply. Sylvie thought about this on the drive back to the farmhouse. She did the math in her head against the west quarter acreage, against the operating loan, against the savings account that had been at a little over $12,000 in the fall of 2003, and that the family was drawing down at a rate of about $7,000 a year. She did the math a second time after supper, at the kitchen table. She wrote Dr. Petrenko a letter 2 weeks later. The years 2004 and 2005 were the years of the drought and the difficult math. The wheat came in short in 2004. The basis moved against her. The operating loan renewed at terms that were slightly worse than the previous year. Herb came over in September of 2004 and sat at the kitchen table in the way he sat when he had something to say that he'd been thinking about for a while. Sylvie. Yes, Herb. I've been looking at the west quarter numbers. I know. If the SEA buckthorn doesn't bear by 2007, the operating loan is going to be at the ceiling. I know that too. He looked at his hands. Your father-in-law is 75 years old. I have some money put by that Gord's mother left when she passed that I haven't spent because I'm 75, and there's nothing I particularly need. The money is yours if you need it. She shook her head. Herb, I'm not taking your money. It's not charity, Sylvie. It's investment. I have watched you run this farm for 3 years, and I know how you run it. I'm not worried about the West Quarter. I'm worried about 2006. She was quiet for a long moment. Give me until spring. He nodded. He walked home. She wrote Dr. Petrenko that night. She wrote about the operating loan. She wrote about the 2 buyers in Calgary who had expressed interest in a supply contract the previous spring. She asked directly whether a spring 2006 harvest was realistic for the planting, and whether the berry volume from a 2-acre block in year 3 would be worth the conversation with a wholesaler. Dr. Petrenko wrote back in 3 weeks. Her letters were always 3 weeks because she wrote them by hand on legal paper and proofread them twice before mailing. The response confirmed that a 2006 pilot harvest was viable from the older crowns, and that the berry volume would be small but non-zero, and that she was personally acquainted with a produce buyer in Calgary named Ha-Yoon-Young, who ran a Korean and Asian ingredient wholesale operation supplying 47 restaurants across Alberta, and who had been looking for a domestic source of SEA buckthorn for her juice and condiment suppliers for 3 years. She gave Sylvie the phone number. Sylvie called from the farmhouse landline on a Tuesday morning in November, while Theo was at school and Lucy was doing homework at the kitchen table. The conversation lasted 18 minutes. Ha-Yoon-Young asked 4 questions. The first was about growing method. The second was about pesticide use. The third was about harvest window. The fourth was whether Sylvie could guarantee delivery at a consistent volume across the harvest season, or whether the supply would be irregular. Sylvie answered each question carefully. She did not promise more than she could deliver. She had been farming for long enough to know that the thing that destroyed supplier relationships was not a small volume. It was an inconsistent one. Ha-Yoon-Young said she would think about it and call back. She called back in 2 days. She offered a trial contract for the 2006 season at $3.90 per pound, with a first right of refusal clause on expanded volume in 2007 and 2008. If the berries were what Sylvie said they were, she would increase the contract. If they weren't, she wouldn't. She was direct about this, and Sylvie appreciated the directness. Theo was home from school by the time the second call ended. He stood in the kitchen door the same way he'd stood in the doorway when Dr. Petrenko had been at the table in 2004. He was 18 now. He'd grown 4 inches in the past year and a half and was beginning to have the posture of a man who has decided what he's going to do with himself. Is it settled? There's a contract for next season. He nodded. He picked up his jacket from the chair. I'm going to go check the planting before it gets dark. He went. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The first commercial harvest from the Marchand West Quarter came on August 14, 2006. Sylvie and Theo and Lucy picked from 5 in the morning until noon. They used the berry combs Dr. Petrenko had recommended, the ones she'd sourced from a Baltic agricultural supplier, because no Canadian farm supply store carried them yet. The berries were orange and dense, and smelled like something between citrus and pine, and Lucy said they smelled like something from another country, and Sylvie said that was accurate, because they were. They harvested 212 pounds that first morning. Theo drove the load to Calgary in the truck, the same truck Gord had bought in 1999, and that Sylvie had kept running past every rational expectation. Ha-Yoon-Young weighed the load at 212.4 pounds. She paid in check on the spot, as agreed, $828. Sylvie folded the check and put it in the kitchen drawer, beside the farm ledger. She did not tell anyone outside the family for 2 weeks. The SEA buckthorn planting was, in its 2006 season, going to produce approximately 900 pounds of berries at the current crown density. The revenue would be around $3,500. Against the operating loan structure, $3,500 was not a rescue. It was a proof. By August of 2007, Sylvie had expanded the planting to 3.5 acres. She had done this by dividing crowns from the 2003 planting, exactly as Dr. Petrenko had specified in her letters, without purchasing new stock. The labor had been Sylvie and Theo and Lucy and Herb, who had walked the planting every second Saturday in the spring of 2006 and 2007, calling out corrections in the spacing the way he had always called out corrections in the straight of a seeding run. He was 78. He was still correct more often than he was wrong. The berry revenue in 2007 was $11,400. The operating loan renewed at slightly better terms. The wheat on the East Quarter came in strong that year, the best since 2000. For the first time since Gord had died, the Marchand farm ran a positive net for the full calendar year. Sylvie did not celebrate. She wrote the number in the ledger. She closed the ledger. She made supper. Spencer Dahl, who had watched the planting from the grid road in August 2003, without stopping, stopped on the road again in September of 2007. He sat in his truck for longer this time. The SEA Buckthorn hedge was 8 feet tall and ran the full length of the west fence line of the property, and it was carrying orange berries at a density that was visible from the road. There was a hand-lettered sign at the end of Sylvie's driveway that Lucy had painted the previous spring, reading Marchand Farm, SEA Buckthorn Berries, in season August. A car from Calgary was parked at the end of the lane, which had happened twice a week through August and was becoming a feature of the property that the neighborhood had noticed. Spencer drove past. He drove past again on the way back. He stopped the truck in the ditch and got out. He walked to Sylvie's porch. He knocked. She came out. Spencer, Sylvie. He took his cap off. He was 65 years old. He had been farming the quarter to the west for 40 years. He was a man who held his words carefully, the way prairie farmers hold equipment, not because they don't use it, but because they know how much it costs to replace what breaks. I've been watching your west quarter for 4 years. I know you have. I told people at the elevator in 2003 that you were making a mistake. I heard that. He looked at the hedge line. From the porch, it was taller than it looked from the road. Sylvie, I am not a man who drives past a mistake for 4 years and doesn't eventually stop. I drove past for 4 years. This is me stopping. She looked at him. Spencer, you can come in. I'll put the kettle on. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, where Herb had sat in March of 2003. Where the loan officer Greg had sat in April of 2003, where Dr. Petrenko had sat in 2004, and where Ha-Yoon Young had sat once in 2006 when she'd driven up from Calgary to see the planting. It was a table that had held a lot of conversation about the West Quarter, and the conversation had changed over the years in a way that the table could not have predicted in the beginning. Spencer Dahl spent 2 hours at that table. He was not a man who apologized easily, and he did not apologize easily now. But he said, plainly and without embellishment, that he had been wrong about what the hedge would do to the West Quarter, and that he had said so to people at the elevator, and that the saying so had been wrong, and he wanted Sylvie to know that he knew it. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He said what he said, and he sat with it. Lucy was at the kitchen table doing homework. She was 16. She did not look up from her textbook, but she was listening with the particular attention of a young person who is recording something. Sylvie accepted his apology. She poured a second cup of tea. Spencer Dahl went home. He came back 2 weeks later with a bag of his wife's oatmeal cookies and a question about nitrogen-fixing species. He came back 4 times before Christmas. By the following March, he was asking about whether his own southwest quarter might support a pilot planting. Herb died in his sleep in February of 2011. He was 82. He had walked the SEA Buckthorn planting every Saturday for the previous 4 years, calling out July, corrections in the spacing that nobody needed corrected anymore, but that everyone listened to anyway, because the corrections were as much about continuity as they were about spacing. His funeral was at the United Church in Eckville. Spencer Dahl drove the 20 minutes from his farm to attend. He sat in the row behind Sylvie. He did not speak during the service, but afterward, in the church basement, he shook Theo's hand and said that Herb Marchand had been the most observant farmer he'd ever known, and that the west quarter of the Marchand farm was his proof. Lucy graduated from the University of Alberta in 2012 with a degree in environmental biology. She came home. She had decided in her third year that she was going to come home permanently, and that she was going to turn the farm into a demonstration site for dryland shrub integration on Peace Country farmland. There were grain farmers across a wide area of central and northern Alberta who were fighting the same losing battle with the same southwest-facing slopes and the same thinning topsoil and the same wheat prices that weren't covering depreciation. She had seen it from the kitchen table since she was 12. She wanted to do something about it beyond the scope of one farm. She brought her partner, a man named Isaac Biosolale, who had grown up on a mixed operation near Barhead and who had spent 3 years with an environmental consulting firm in Edmonton before Lucy convinced him that the work she was describing was more interesting than anything he was doing in the city. He moved to the farm in 2013. He built a propagation shed for the Crown Division program. He built a small cold storage unit for the berry harvest. Theo married in 2014 and moved to his wife's family's operation near Ponoka. He drove back to the Marchand farm every harvest, every single one. He had not missed a harvest since the first one in 2006. By 2015, the Marchand SEA Buckthorn planting covered 11 acres across 3 fields. The berry revenue had passed $60,000. The farm was supplying 9 wholesalers across Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. Ha Yun Young had increased her contract 3 times. The soil organic matter on the west quarter south slope, which had been at 51% of baseline in 2003, was at 67% of baseline in 2015. Still degraded by historical standards, but moving the right direction for the first time since anyone had been measuring it. Dr. Petrenko retired from the University of Lethbridge in 2016. She had continued to visit the Marchand farm every second year for 13 years. Always in the same Civic, which by 2016 had passed 450,000 kilometers and was, by any mechanical standard, impossible. She brought a colleague on her last visit, a young soil scientist named Dr. Tran, who was taking over her research program and who was writing his first paper on nitrogen dynamics in SEA Buckthorn buffer strips in Zone 3. Sylvie gave him the soil test records going back to 2003, all 13 years. He had not expected 13 years of records. He sat at the kitchen table with them for 4 hours. Dr. Petrenko stood in the planting on her last visit. The hedgerow on the west quarter was 12 feet tall and 300 meters long. She stood at the south end of it and looked north along the row. She had seen it in 2004 when it was 18 inches. She had seen it in 2008 when it was 8 feet. She had seen it in 2012 when it was 10. She had seen what it had done to the soil below the canopy and to the wheat ground east of the line and to the snow retention on the south slope in winter, which added, depending on the year, between 11 and 16 additional days of soil moisture in spring, which translated to wheat protein numbers that were consistently 1.5 points above the regional average, which translated to a basis premium that was modest but real, and that had been real every year since 2009. She didn't say any of this. She didn't need to. She stood at the south end of the row and looked north, and Sylvie stood beside her and looked north, and the two of them stood there for a while in the kind of silence that doesn't require filling. But it was a dry July, Sylvie continued to walk the planting 22 when she was 62 and her hip was telling her things she didn't entirely want to hear. Lucy walked with her from the summer of 2019. When Lucy's daughter Bex was 4 years old and began to follow them both in rubber boots that were one size too large, asking questions about every plant she could reach. Bex had a composition notebook with a yellow cover by the time she was 6. She had written Dr. Petrenko's name on the first page because Lucy had told her that was the right name to start with. She had written the Latin names of both shrub species below it correctly, without a question mark, because she had looked them up herself. The farming community in central Alberta, by 2022, was not the same community that had laughed in 2003. It was not that the laughter had been forgotten. Laughter like that doesn't get forgotten in small farming communities. What happened was that the laughter had been absorbed into the longer story of the place. The way all mistakes are absorbed eventually, not erased, but held. The way a hedgerow holds snow, doing something useful with what it catches. Spencer Dahl's southwest quarter had a SEA buckthorn buffer strip. By 2009, the strip had been planted with crowns divided from the Marchand west quarter. 3 other farms within 15 kilometers had followed by 2014. The Marchand farm had supplied the crown stock for all of them. Every planting was descended from the 48 crowns that Sylvie had driven 7 hours south to collect in February of 2003, in the whiteout that closed the Ponoka interchange, in the years after Gord died, and before anyone believed what she was doing was going to amount to anything. Lucy and Isaac ran the formal crown division and propagation program out of the shed Isaac had built. By 2020, they had supplied starting stock to 22 farms across Alberta and into Saskatchewan. Every farm was different. The soil was different, the aspect was different, the operators were different, but every planting carried, in its rootstock, the genetic material of the original 48 crowns that a woman from Eckville had carried home in the back of a half-ton truck in the winter of 2003 because she had read a paper and done the math and decided that the math said something different than the laugh at. The Tim Hortons was saying. Herb had said on one of his Saturday walks in 2008 that his own mother had kept a stand of buffalo berry along the north fence of the original homestead, the 160-acre parcel his grandfather had filed on in 1912. She had kept it because her mother had told her to keep it, and her mother's mother before that had kept something similar in the yard of the house in Manitoba where she had come from, and before that there had been something similar on the farm in Ontario, and before that in the village in southern England where the first Marchands had lived. Before they came to Canada in the 1840s, he had not thought about the buffalo berry stand since it had been cleared in 1964 to run the fence line straight. He had not thought about it for 44 years until Sylvie put shrubs on the west quarter, and he walked out to look at them on a Saturday morning, and remembered. Sylvie had been quiet when he said this. She had walked the row for a moment before she responded. Herb, why do you think we cleared the buffalo berry? He didn't answer immediately. He walked a few more steps, because we forgot what it was for. Yes, because we forgot long enough that we didn't notice it was gone until something reminded us. Yes, Lucy was walking behind them. She had the green notebook. She wrote it down. Bex walked the planting with her grandmother in the summer of 2022. Bex was 7. The planting was 19 years old. The original crowns from 2003 were taller than the shed roof. Bex asked questions in the methodical way she had already developed, working through topics from one end to the other as though she were mapping them. Gran, yes. Were you scared when you planted them? Sylvie walked a few steps. Yes. What were you scared of? I was scared that the laughter was right. I was scared that I had misread the numbers, and that the man at the elevator and Spencer Dahl and the people at the Legion were seeing something I wasn't seeing. But they weren't. No, but I didn't know that in 2003. In 2003, I only knew what the soil tests said, and what Dr. Petrenko said, and what my own numbers said. That's all I had to go on. Bex thought about this. She stopped in front of one of the original crowns from 2003. It was dense and thorned and about 12 feet tall, and had been producing berries in August for 16 years. Gran, is that enough? Just your own numbers? Sylvie looked at the crown for a moment. It had been a shrub, bare root division the size of a shoebox when she'd carried it home in 2003. There was no version of 2003 in which it had looked like this. If the numbers are right, she said, yes, that's enough. The hard part is being sure your numbers are right and not just telling yourself what you want to hear. That's the part that takes work. Bex wrote this in the yellow notebook. The hedgerow on the west quarter was 19 feet tall by 2022. The south slope of the field, which had been losing topsoil since before Sylvie had arrived on the farm, had been net gaining organic matter for 7 consecutive years. The wheat ground east of the hedgerow was producing at a consistent protein premium above the regional average. Spencer Dahl, who was 80 years old and had handed his operation to his son the previous year, drove past the Marchand farm on the grid road most Sundays still. He always slowed at the west quarter. He had told his son, who was a careful farmer, and who listened to his father, that the hedgerow on the Marchand west quarter was the most instructive thing he had seen in 60 years of farming in central Alberta, and that the instruction was not about SEA BUCKTHORN. The instruction was about what happens when someone does the right thing in a place where the right thing has not been done before, and the community laughs and the person keeps going anyway, not in defiance, but in patience, with the long patience of someone who has looked at the numbers and believes what the numbers say, and is willing to wait for the numbers to be proven out in the only place that matters, which is the ground. The community would always laugh. The community would always laugh, sometimes for a season, sometimes for years. The laughter was not an answer. The laughter was a question the community was asking about whether what it knew was still enough, and the only way to answer that question was to keep planting and to tend what you'd planted, and to wait. Sylvie had known this since the drive back from Lethbridge in February of 2003. Through the whiteout on Highway 11, with 48 root crowns in the truck bed, and the Ponoka interchange closed behind her, and the farm sitting dark in the winter 3 hours to the north. She had known it, and she had kept it, the way the hedgerow kept the snow, doing something useful with what it caught. That was the only lesson she had ever needed to give, and she gave it to Bex on a summer morning in 2022, walking the rows, saying very little.